Hold up your hand, look at it closely. Whatever color stares back at you, that shade is not an accident. It is not random pigment splashed on at birth. It is a message written in a molecular alphabet sent by every single ancestor who came before you. And the message took almost 2 million years to finish. Here is where the story actually begins, and it starts earlier than most people think. Long before Homo sapiens existed, long before anyone had a word for skin color, your ancestors were losing something. Fur. Around 2 million years ago, early hominins like Homo erectus began shedding the thick body hair that had covered primates for millions of years. Nobody knows the exact trigger, but the leading theory is brutally practical. Hairless skin sweats better. Sweating better means a body that can cool itself while running long distances under an equatorial sun, chasing prey that overheats faster than it does. Losing fur turned your ancestors into endurance machines. But there was a catch, a massive one. Fur is a shield. It blocks sunlight before it ever touches skin. Take the fur away, and suddenly bare skin is exposed directly to one of the most aggressive light sources on the planet. Hour after hour, day after day, generation after generation. Evolution had just solved one problem and created another in the same breath. So skin needed a new kind of armor, not hair. Something built into the tissue itself. That something was melanin, and once it appeared, it spread through early hominin populations with startling speed, because the alternative was almost certain cellular damage. By the time anatomically modern humans, your direct ancestors, emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago, this process was already ancient history. Every one of them was dark-skinned, not most, not the majority, every single one. There was no variation yet, no spectrum, no pale populations tucked away anywhere on Earth waiting to be discovered. The concept of light skin simply did not exist. Sit with that for a second. Every civilization you have ever read about, every myth, every dynasty, every face carved into ancient stone, all of it descends from a single founding population that, if you saw them walking toward you today, would look nothing like a significant portion of the human species now walking the planet. Something changed after that. Something so powerful it reshaped the outward appearance of entire continents of people over tens of thousands of years. To understand what that something was, you first have to understand what skin is actually doing for you, because most people treat it like packaging. A wrapper, the bag your organs came in. It is not packaging, it is an organ, your largest one, and it was about to become the site of one of the most consequential biological negotiations in human history. Skin has one job that matters more than almost any other for this story, standing between your DNA and the sun. Sunlight carries ultraviolet radiation, an invisible current of energy that does not care what it hits. UV light snaps chemical bonds. It scrambles the code written into your cells. And when that scrambled code gets copied over and over, the errors compound. Enough errors in the wrong place and you get melanoma, one of the fastest, most aggressive cancers the human body can produce. This is where melanin earns its keep. Melanin is not just a pigment. It is a filter absorbing UV energy before it can punch through to the deeper layers of skin, where your DNA actually lives. More melanin means a thicker filter. A thicker filter means fewer mutations, less cancer, a longer runway to survive, reproduce, and pass those genes forward. Near the equator, under some of the harshest sunlight on the planet, this filter was not optional. It was the price of admission. Evolution does not hand out participation trophies. It runs a single relentless test, generation after generation. Did this trait help you live long enough to have children? Dark skin passed that test every single time in Africa, without exception. But cancer was only half the danger, and this half almost never makes it into the popular version of this story. Inside your bloodstream right now is a nutrient called folate, a form of vitamin B9. Folate is essential in the earliest days of pregnancy, often before a woman even knows she has conceived, because it drives the formation of the neural tube, the structure that becomes the brain and spinal cord. Starve that process of folate and the neural tube can fail to close. The result is catastrophic: severe birth defects or a pregnancy that ends before it properly begins. Here's the part that connects the dots. UV radiation does not just damage skin cells, It also breaks down folate as light penetrates the bloodstream. In an environment with constant, unfiltered equatorial sun, unshielded skin was quietly sabotaging pregnancies by destroying a nutrient the fetus desperately needed. So, there were now two independent forces pushing in the exact same direction. One threat aimed at the individual in the form of cancer risk. One threat aimed at the next generation in the form of failed pregnancies. Two separate biological alarms, both silenced by the same solution. Dark skin under the African sun was not simply advantageous, it was close to mandatory. Any lineage that drifted toward less melanin in that environment was quite literally editing itself out of the future. Which raises an obvious question. If dark skin was such an effective, thoroughly field-tested solution, why does most of the world not look like the earliest humans did? Why did entire populations end up with far less melanin at all? The answer begins the moment your ancestors started walking north. Somewhere between 70 and 100,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens began drifting out of Africa. Not in one dramatic exodus. No announcement, no single crossing. Just generations, each one settling slightly farther than the last, until humans had spread through the Middle East, into Europe, across Asia, and eventually into the Americas. And as they moved, the sun itself seemed to change. It had not, of course. The sun was exactly as indifferent as ever. What changed was the angle. At higher latitudes, sunlight strikes the Earth at a shallower slant, passing through far more atmosphere before it reaches skin. Winters stretch long and dim. Skies stay overcast for months. The UV environment in northern Europe or northern Asia bears almost no resemblance to the UV environment near the equator. Suddenly, the melanin that had been a life-saving shield in Africa became something closer to a liability. Not because of cancer. Weak, filtered sunlight at northern latitudes posed far less of that risk. The real problem was a molecule most people never think about until the doctor mentions it. Vitamin D. Your skin manufactures vitamin D using UVB radiation as raw fuel, essentially functioning as a small solar panel wired into your bloodstream. And vitamin D is not a luxury nutrient. It governs how your gut absorbs calcium and phosphorus. Without it, calcium intake barely matters because the body cannot use what it cannot absorb. Bones stop mineralizing properly. In children, this produces rickets, a disease that bows the legs, flattens the skull, and stalls growth entirely. In adult women, a related condition called osteomalacia softens the pelvic bones, turning childbirth into a dangerous, sometimes fatal ordeal. Now picture a population with highly efficient UV-blocking melanin, suddenly living under weak, scarce northern sunlight. Their skin cannot distinguish between UV that is dangerous and UV that is desperately needed. It simply blocks. Vitamin D synthesis drops, bones weaken, birth complications climb. Over generations, this quietly shows up as lower survival, and evolution begins doing what it always does, favoring whatever variation happens to work better. Random mutations that reduced melanin production began appearing, as mutations always do. But instead of vanishing, they spread, because the people carrying them synthesized more vitamin D, built stronger skeletons, and survived childbirth more often. Generation after generation, the dial turned slightly lighter. Here is a detail that genetics has only recently uncovered, and it complicates the tidy version of the story. Modern humans were not the only lineage running this experiment. Neanderthals, an entirely separate branch of the human family living across Ice Age Europe, evolved their own variants tied to pale skin and red hair, through completely different genetic mutations than the ones that would later appear in Homo sapiens. Two separate species, unrelated at the genetic level, independently discovered that lighter skin solved the same northern light problem. Evolution was not improvising once. It was rerunning the same experiment in parallel, in different labs, with different starting materials, and arriving at a strikingly similar answer. For a long time, researchers assumed this lightening in modern humans was slow and gradual, unfolding steadily across tens of thousands of years as people drifted north. Ancient DNA has overturned that assumption. Early European hunter-gatherers, people living in places like Britain for thousands of years after the migration out of Africa, were still notably dark-skinned. The shift toward the pale skin now associated with northwestern Europe seems to have taken hold widely only in roughly the last 6,000 to 8,000 years. Out of a 300,000-year history, that is a sliver of time, arriving suspiciously close to one particular turning point in human civilization: the invention of farming. Hunter-gatherers ate a diet naturally rich in vitamin D, oily fish, organ meat, shellfish. Once agriculture took hold, diets shifted hard toward grain: wheat, barley, oats. Vitamin D intake from food collapsed almost overnight in evolutionary terms, which meant skin alone now had to carry the entire burden of production. Any remaining darkness in the skin became a much steeper liability, and the selection pressure toward lighter skin intensified sharply. Dense farming villages, unlike scattered hunter-gatherer bands, also let beneficial mutations spread through far more descendants in far fewer generations. Diet and demographics together hit the accelerator on a process that had been crawling along for millennia. One of the clearest windows into this shift comes from a skeleton known as Cheddar Man, who lived in what is now Britain roughly 10,000 years ago. Ancient DNA analysis published in 2018 suggested he likely carried dark to medium dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes, a combination that looks almost contradictory to modern eyes, since we have quietly come to associate blue eyes with pale skin. 10,000 years ago, that link had not been forged yet. Blue eyes themselves carry an equally strange origin story. Every person alive today with blue eyes traces that trait back to a single individual. One person, one mutation, somewhere near the Black Sea roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Before that person existed, human eyes were uniformly brown. The mutation reduced melanin production specifically in the iris, and it spread, likely riding alongside the broader wave of skin-lightening variants moving through the same populations. A trait that feels ancient and fundamental, one that has been used for centuries to sort people into categories, is in reality younger than farming, younger than the first cities, younger than domesticated horses. Skin color, then, is not really about identity or ancestry in the way it gets used culturally. At its core, it is a calibration setting, a UV dial tuned generation by generation to match the latitude, the diet, and the sun exposure a population happened to inherit. This mechanism has not switched off. It is still running today, just muffled by modern life. Consider the populations who moved from equatorial regions to high-latitude cities in the last century or two, a timescale far too short for skin to biologically catch up. Public health researchers have documented resurgences of rickets and vitamin D deficiency in exactly these communities. Dark-skinned populations living indoors, covered against the cold, under the same weak northern sun that once reshaped entire lineages over thousands of years. The ancient mismatch between melanin and light has not disappeared. It has simply moved into modern apartments, modern clinics, modern diagnoses, playing out on an individual timescale instead of an evolutionary one. Light skin is not an upgrade. In equatorial environments, it is a liability, one that raises cancer risk and threatens pregnancies through folate loss. Dark skin is not a primitive baseline waiting to be improved upon. It is the ancestral configuration, the setting every human being started from before geography and diet pulled certain populations in a different direction. And the sun, through all of it, never picked a side. It did not favor pale skin or dark skin, did not care which populations thrived and which struggled. It simply radiated indifferent and constant, while evolution quietly sorted out the consequences on every continent humans reached. Civilizations built entire systems of hierarchy, prejudice, and violence on top of what is, underneath all of it, a vitamin D problem, a calcium absorption issue, a folate protection mechanism written into skin by a star 93 million miles away that never once had an opinion about any of it. The process has not stopped. Human populations are still shifting, still adjusting, even if the changes are too slow to notice within a single lifetime. Modern life has scrambled the original inputs, sunscreen, supplements, fortified food, indoor living, but the underlying algorithm has not been switched off. It has just been handed a stranger set of variables to work with, and where that leads over the next 100,000 years is not something anyone can predict with certainty. What can be said with confidence is this: every shade of human skin alive today is a record, written directly into the body of every environment an ancestor once stood in. Every tone on the spectrum is an answer to a question the sun kept asking, over and over for 300,000 years. And every single answer in its own time and place was correct.